The air in Ethan Carver's small apartment in Burlington, Vermont, hung heavy with the scent of damp wood and stale takeout. The single bulb lamp on his desk flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cluttered room, papers strewn across the coffee table, an unwashed mug of coffee gone cold, a half-eaten pizza slice hardening on a paper plate. Ethan, 29, slouched in his chair, his laptop screen glowing with the dull monotony of freelance graphic design work. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the keyboard, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the weekend hike in the Green Mountains. The forest had been alive with the hum of cicadas, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the sharp sting of pine in his lungs. It was supposed to be a reset, a way to shake off the gnawing restlessness that had clung to him for months. A vague, unshakable sense that he was wasting his life, stuck in a cycle of deadlines and isolation. His shoulder throbbed, a dull ache that hadn't let up since the fall. He'd tripped on a gnarled root during the hike, tumbling down a rocky slope and slamming his left shoulder against a jagged boulder. The pain had been immediate, a white-hot jolt that stole his breath, but he'd laughed it off to his hiking buddy Matt, claiming it was just a bruise. Matt had raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Ethan was good at brushing things off. Pain, guilt, the quiet shame of feeling like he was falling behind in a world that demanded constant motion. He'd always been the guy who handled it, the one who didn't complain, even when the weight of his own expectations pressed harder than any injury. Now, sitting in his apartment, the ache in his shoulder felt different. It wasn't just sore, it was wrong. A faint, persistent itch crawled beneath the skin, like a mosquito bite left too long unscratched. He rubbed at it absently, his fingers grazing the tender spot just above his collarbone. The skin felt too warm, almost feverish, and there was something else, a faint hardness, like a pebble lodged under the surface. Ethan frowned, pressing harder. The sensation sent a shiver down his spine, not from pain but from something deeper, something primal. It was as if his body was trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to hear. He stood, stretching, and shuffled to the bathroom, the linoleum floor cold against his bare feet. The mirror above the sink was smudged, reflecting a distorted version of his face, pale, with faint shadows under his hazel eyes, his dark hair a mess from running his hands through it. He tilted his head, pulling the collar of his t-shirt aside to inspect his shoulder. The skin looked normal enough, maybe a little red, but nothing alarming. Just a bruise, he told himself, ignoring the way his stomach twisted. He scratched the spot again, and this time, his fingers caught on something. A tiny, raised bump, no bigger than a pea. It was firm, unyielding, and when he pressed it, a faint pulse seemed to throb beneath it, out of sync with his heartbeat. "Great," he muttered, forcing a laugh. "Probably just a knot from the fall." He grabbed a bottle of ibuprofen from the medicine cabinet, the pills rattling like tiny bones, and swallowed two with a gulp of tap water that tasted faintly of rust. The apartment was quiet except for the steady drip of a leak somewhere in the ceiling, a sound that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. But tonight, it felt louder, more insistent, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something he couldn't name. Ethan tried to focus on work, but the itch in his shoulder grew worse, spreading like a slow burn. He shifted in his chair, rolling his shoulder to loosen it, but the motion only sharpened the sensation. It wasn't just an itch now, it was a crawling, like ants marching beneath his skin. He closed his laptop with a sigh and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The water stain above him had spread since last week, its edges curling like the petals of some grotesque flower. He wondered, not for the first time, if the dampness in the apartment was getting to him, seeping into his lungs, his bones. The thought made him shudder, and he pushed it away, grabbing his phone to text Matt. "Shoulders acting up from the hike. You ever get weird aches after a fall?" Matt's reply came quickly. "Bruises suck, man. Ice it. You good?" Ethan typed yeah, fine, and tossed the phone onto the couch. He wasn't fine, but admitting that felt like admitting defeat. He'd always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone to hold his hand through life's rough patches. But as he sat there, the itch in his shoulder deepening into a faint gnawing pain, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. He wandered to the kitchen, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like a trapped insect. The fridge hummed, its contents meager, a carton of milk past its expiration date, a jar of pickles, a stick of butter. He grabbed a beer, the cold glass soothing against his palm, and took a long swig. The bitterness lingered on his tongue, mixing with a faint metallic taste he couldn't place. He frowned, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and that's when he felt it, a slickness on his fingers. He glanced down, expecting to see beer or sweat, but his fingers were smeared with something else. A thin, grayish fluid, oily and faintly shimmering, like the residue of a burst blister. Ethan's heart skipped. He yanked his t-shirt aside again, his breath catching as he saw the bump on his shoulder. It was bigger now, the size of a grape, and the skin around it was taut, faintly discolored, like a bruise that had ripened too fast. He pressed it gingerly, and the bump yielded slightly, releasing another bead of that strange, gray fluid. It trickled down his collarbone, leaving a trail that smelled faintly of damp earth and something sharper, like burnt wiring. His stomach churned, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. He grabbed a paper towel, wiping the fluid away, but the smell lingered, clinging to his skin like a second shadow. He told himself it was nothing, a weird reaction to the injury, maybe an infection from rolling around in the dirt. He'd see a doctor tomorrow if it didn't improve. But as he stood there, the drip of the ceiling leak echoing in the silence, he couldn't shake the image of the forest. The gnarled roots, the jagged boulder, the way the air had felt too thick, too alive, as if the trees themselves were watching him fall. He'd laughed it off then, but now, the memory felt heavy, tinged with something darker. Ethan crawled into bed, pulling the covers over himself like a shield. The apartment was cold, the radiator hissing faintly in the corner, and the damp air seemed to settle into his bones. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, but the itch in his shoulder pulsed like a second heartbeat, relentless and alive. He drifted into a fitful doze, images of the forest flickering through his mind, twisted branches, moss slick with something that wasn't water, a low hum that wasn't quite wind. Then, in the dead of night, he woke with a start, his breath ragged. The room was pitch black, the leaks dripped louder now, almost rhythmic. His shoulder burned, the pain sharp and electric, but that wasn't what woke him. It was the sound, a faint, brittle crack, like the snapping of a twig, coming from inside his shoulder. He reached up, trembling, and pressed the bump. It moved beneath his fingers, not like a muscle or a bruise, but like something alive, grinding against the shattered bones within. Ethan woke to the gray light of dawn seeping through the blinds, the air in his Burlington apartment thick with a musty scent of damp plaster. His shoulder throbbed, a deep, gnawing ache that seemed to pulse in time with the drip of the ceiling leak. The sound was louder now, a steady plink-plink that grated on his nerves. He lay still for a moment, hoping the pain was just a remnant of a bad dream, but the memory of the night before, the brittle crack inside his shoulder, the oily gray fluid, clung to him like damp cloth. He reached up, fingers trembling, and touched the bump. It was still there, larger now, the size of a walnut, its surface taut and unnaturally smooth, like the skin of a ripe fruit about to split. He forced himself out of bed, the cold floor sending a shiver up his spine. The apartment felt smaller today, the walls pressing in, the air heavy with a faint, acrid smell he couldn't place, something like burnt rubber mixed with wet soil. He shuffled to the bathroom, avoiding the mirror at first, afraid of what he might see. When he finally looked, his reflection was a ghost of himself, pale, eyes sunken, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. He pulled his t-shirt aside, and his breath caught. The bump on his shoulder had darkened, a sickly grayish purple, like a bruise left too long to fester. Tiny veins, thin as spider silk, radiated from it, spreading beneath the skin like cracks in porcelain. When he pressed the bump, it yielded with a faint squelch, releasing a bead of that same gray fluid. It trickled down his chest, leaving a trail that smelled sharp and chemical, like gasoline mixed with decay. Ethan gagged, grabbing a washcloth to wipe it away. The cloth came back streaked with gray, the fluid clinging to the fibers like ink. He tossed it into the sink, his hands shaking, and tried to focus on his morning routine. Coffee, email, work, normalcy. He had a deadline for a client, a logo redesign for some craft brewery, and he couldn't afford to fall behind. But as he sat at his desk, the laptop screen blurring before his eyes, the pain in his shoulder sharpened, radiating down his arm like a current. The itch had become a burn, and beneath it, a faint sensation of movement, like something shifting under the skin, grinding against the broken bones from his fall. He tried to ignore it, typing with one hand while the other rested protectively over his shoulder. But the sensation grew worse, a slow, writhing motion that made his stomach churn. He stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee mug. The liquid spilled across the desk, soaking into papers and pooling around his phone. The smell of coffee mixed with the chemical reek from his shoulder, and for a moment he thought he might vomit. He stumbled to the kitchen, splashing cold water on his face, but the water felt wrong, too slick, as if the pipes were tainted. He glanced out the window, where the Burlington skyline was shrouded in mist, the buildings looming like silent sentinels. A single crow perched on the fire escape, its black eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Ethan shivered, drawing the curtains shut. He texted Matt again, his fingers clumsy on the screen. Shoulders worse. Think I need a doc. You free to grab a beer later? He didn't expect Matt to understand. He barely understood himself. But the thought of being alone with this thing, this wrongness in his body, was unbearable. Matt's reply was quick. Damn man, sounds rough. Yeah, let's hit Rusty Nail tonight. Get it checked out. Ethan nodded to himself, clinging to the promise of normalcy. A bar, a friend, a distraction. But normalcy was hard to maintain. At the grocery store later that morning, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Too bright, too harsh. Ethan kept his hoodie pulled up, the sleeve covering his shoulder, but he couldn't shake the feeling that people were staring. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, wrinkled her nose as she scanned his items. You okay, hon? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. Ethan forced a smile, muttering something about a long night, but he caught a whiff of himself, a sharp metallic odor that cut through the store's sterile air. It was coming from his shoulder, from the bump that seemed to pulse with every step. Back at the apartment, he avoided work and paced instead, the pain now a constant companion. He tried icing the bump, but the cold only made it throb harder, and when he removed the ice pack, the skin was slick with more of that gray fluid, now thicker, almost syrupy. It left a stain on the ice pack, a faint shimmer that caught the light like oil on water. Ethan's heart raced, his mind spiraling. Was it an infection? Something from the forest? He remembered the boulder he'd hit, its surface slick with moss and something else. Something dark and viscous, like sap but heavier. Had it gotten into his skin, his blood? He called a walk-in clinic, his voice unsteady as he booked an appointment for the next day. The receptionist's bored tone did little to calm him, and when he hung up, the silence of the apartment felt oppressive, broken only by the relentless drip of the leak. He sat on the couch, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. It had grown again, its edges curling inward, like a mouth slowly opening. He blinked, and for a moment he thought he saw it move, a faint ripple, like something breathing beneath the plaster. That evening, at the Rusty Nail, the bar's dim lighting and the hum of conversation offered a brief reprieve. Matt was already there, nursing a beer, his easy grin a stark contrast to Ethan's fraying nerves. You look like shit, Matt said, sliding a pint across the table. Ethan laughed, but it sounded hollow. He kept his hoodie on, the sleeve pulled low, but the pain in his shoulder was relentless now, a deep, grinding ache that felt like bones scraping together. He sipped his beer, the taste bitter and metallic, like blood. Matt leaned forward, frowning. Dude, what's that smell? You spill something. Ethan froze, his face burning with shame. Just some weird soap, he lied, his voice tight. He excused himself to the bathroom, the bar's sticky floor clinging to his shoes. In the flickering light of the restroom, he locked the door and peeled back his sleeve. The bump had grown again, now the size of a small egg. Its surface stretched so thin he could see something moving beneath it. Tiny, thread-like shapes, writhing like worms in a puddle. He pressed it, and a low, wet pop echoed in the small room as a trickle of gray fluid oozed out. Thicker now, flecked with dark specks that looked like ash. The smell was overpowering, a mix of burnt plastic and rotting leaves, and Ethan gagged, his vision swimming. He stumbled back to the table, muttering an excuse about feeling sick, and fled the bar. The Burlington streets were quiet, the air damp with the threat of rain. He walked quickly, head down, the pain in his shoulder now a searing heat that spread down his arm, numbing his fingers. His apartment was a blur as he fumbled with the keys, the drip of the leak greeting him like an old enemy. He collapsed onto the couch, his breath ragged, and pulled his sleeve up again. The bump was pulsing now, a slow, deliberate rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat. He leaned closer to the mirror in the hallway, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows across his face. And then he heard it, a faint, rasping sound, like air escaping a punctured tire. It was coming from his shoulder, from the bump. He froze, his heart pounding, as the sound shifted, becoming clearer, more distinct. It wasn't air. It was a voice, low and guttural, whispering a single word over and over. Ethan. The whisper lingered in Ethan's ears, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to echo inside his skull even after he'd stumbled away from the mirror. His Burlington apartment was a tomb of shadows, the single lamp flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The air was thick with the stench of damp rot and that sharp, chemical reek from his shoulder, a smell that clung to his clothes, his skin, his very breath. Ethan sat on the edge of his couch, clutching his left arm, which now felt heavy, almost numb, as if it belonged to someone else. The bump on his shoulder had grown to the size of a plum. Its surface stretched so thin it glistened under the dim light, veined with dark, thread-like tendrils that pulsed faintly, like roots burrowing deeper into his flesh. He hadn't slept since the bar last night, hadn't dared to close his eyes after hearing that voice. His name, spoken in a tone that wasn't human, wasn't even alive. It had come from the bump, he was sure of it, though his mind screamed that it was impossible. He tried to drown it out with music, with the TV, with anything, but the whisper cut through, sharp and insistent, like a needle in his brain. Ethan. 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 Each syllable was accompanied by a faint grinding sensation in his shoulder, as if the shattered bones from his fall were shifting, rearranging themselves into something new. He forced himself to move, to act normal, to cling to the fraying threads of his routine. He had a doctor's appointment at the walk-in clinic today, a lifeline he grasped with desperate hope. Maybe it was an infection, something explainable, treatable. He dressed carefully, choosing a loose flannel shirt to hide the growing deformity, but the fabric felt wrong against his skin. Too rough, too tight, as if his body was rejecting it. The mirror in the hallway was a forbidden zone now. He avoided it, afraid of what he might see, afraid of hearing that voice again. The clinic was a short walk from his apartment, but the journey felt endless. Burlington streets were slick with morning drizzle, the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and something sharper, like rusted iron. Ethan kept his head down, his hood pulled low, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching him. A woman pushing a stroller glanced his way, her nose wrinkling as if she'd caught a whiff of something foul. A jogger slowed as he passed, his eyes lingering on Ethan's hunched posture. Ethan quickened his pace, the pain in his shoulder flaring with each step, a deep, bone-aching burn that radiated down his arm and into his chest. His left hand tingled, the fingers sluggish, as if the nerves were fraying. Inside the clinic, the sterile smell of disinfectant did little to mask the odor emanating from his shoulder, a mix of burnt plastic and decaying leaves that made his stomach lurch. The waiting room was crowded, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of insects. Ethan sat in a corner, his arm cradled against his chest, trying to ignore the stares of the other patients. A child across from him pointed, whispering to her mother, and Ethan felt a hot flush of shame. He pulled his sleeve lower, but the movement caused the bump to shift, sending a jolt of pain through his body. He bit his lip, tasting blood, and realized the metallic tang in his mouth wasn't new. It had been there all morning, growing stronger. When the nurse called his name, Ethan followed her to an exam room, the linoleum floor squeaking under his sneakers. The doctor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a distracted air, barely looked up from his clipboard. "So, shoulder pain?" he asked, his tone clipped. Ethan nodded, his throat tight, and peeled back his sleeve to reveal the bump. The doctor's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his professional mask slipped back into place. "Looks like a cyst," he said, prodding the lump with gloved fingers. Ethan winced, the touch sending a wave of nausea through him. The bump seemed to recoil, pulsing harder, and a thin trickle of gray fluid seeped out, staining the doctor's glove. The room filled with that chemical stench, and the doctor stepped back, his nose wrinkling. "Could be infected," he said, scribbling a prescription. "Take these antibiotics. Keep it clean. If it doesn't improve in a week, come back. We might need to drain it." He handed Ethan the slip of paper and ushered him out, his haste betraying his unease. Ethan clutched the prescription, a fragile hope, but the doctor's words felt hollow. A cyst didn't whisper. A cyst didn't move. Back at the apartment, Ethan swallowed the first dose of antibiotics with water that tasted faintly of rust. He tried to clean the bump, dabbing it with antiseptic, but the fluid kept coming, thicker now, flecked with dark, grainy particles that looked like charred soil. The skin around the bump was cracking, splitting into fine, jagged lines that oozed a sticky, grayish pus. He wrapped it in gauze, but the bandage soaked through within minutes, the smell growing stronger, more invasive. It wasn't just chemical now, it was alive, like the rot of a forest floor after a storm, heavy with the promise of decay. He avoided work, ignored Matt's texts asking how the doctor's visit went. The apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in, the water stain on the ceiling now a sprawling, grotesque shape that seemed to pulse in time with his shoulder. He tried to sleep, but his dreams were feverish, filled with images of the forest. Roots curling like fingers, moss that bled black sap, a boulder that hummed with a low, guttural voice. In one dream, he saw his shoulder split open, revealing not muscle or bone but a writhing mass of dark, glistening threads, like vines crawling toward the light. He woke with a scream, his body slick with sweat. The pain in his shoulder was unbearable now, a searing heat that felt like it was burning through his bones. His left arm hung limp, the fingers numb, the skin pale and waxy. He stumbled to the bathroom, unable to avoid the mirror this time. The bump had grown again, its surface no longer smooth but jagged, as if something was pushing outward, straining against the skin. He pressed it, unable to stop himself, and the pain was blinding, a white-hot spike that dropped him to his knees. The gauze fell away, revealing a horror. The skin had split, exposing a raw, glistening mass of tissue that pulsed with a life of its own. Thin, black threads, like veins but alive, wriggled within the wound, their movements slow and deliberate, as if searching for something. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring with tears. He crawled to the sink, splashing water on his face, but the water felt wrong. Too warm, too thick, like it was tainted by the thing in his shoulder. The whisper came again, louder now, not just his name but a string of words, garbled and guttural, like a language he didn't understand. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but the sound was inside him, resonating in his bones. He staggered to the living room, collapsing onto the couch, the drip of the ceiling leak now a deafening rhythm, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. He fumbled for his phone, desperate to call someone. Matt, a doctor, anyone, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate, the numbness spreading up his arm. He stared at the wound, the black threads now longer, curling outward like tendrils, their tips glistening with that gray fluid. And then, in the dim light of the lamp, he saw it. A tiny, glistening orb, no bigger than a marble, nestled in the center of the wound. It pulsed, and as he stared, horrified, it blinked, a single lidless eye, staring back at him from the ruin of his shoulder. Ethan sat frozen on the bathroom floor, the cold tiles biting into his knees, his gaze locked on the mirror. The eye in his shoulder stared back, unblinking, its surface a glossy black that shimmered like oil under the fluorescent light. It wasn't human, it couldn't be, but it moved with a deliberate slowness, swiveling as if taking in the room, as if it saw him. The wound around it gaped wider now, the skin peeled back like torn fabric, exposing a pulsing mass of black threads that writhed like worms in a rain-soaked grave. The air in his Burlington apartment was thick with the stench of decay, rotting leaves, burnt plastic, and something deeper, like the iron tang of blood left to fester. The ceiling leak dripped relentlessly, each plink echoing like a hammer against his skull, syncing with the erratic pulse of the thing in his shoulder. He hadn't left the apartment in days, hadn't answered Matt's calls or texts. His phone lay dead on the coffee table, buried under a pile of unopened mail and takeout containers that reeked of mold. The world outside felt distant, a memory of a life that no longer belonged to him. His left arm was useless now, hanging limp at his side, the fingers swollen and pale, the nails yellowing like old bone. The pain had transcended into something else, a searing, living presence that seemed to crawl through his veins, spreading from his shoulder into his chest, his throat. He could taste it now, a bitter metallic sludge that coated his tongue, as if his body was rotting from the inside out. Ethan had tried to fight it. 2 nights ago, in a fit of desperation, he'd grabbed a kitchen knife, its blade dull and speckled with rust. He'd held it over the wound, his hand trembling, convinced that cutting out the thing, the eye, the threads, would free him. But when he pressed the blade against the bump, the pain was blinding, a white-hot scream that dropped him to his knees. The wound had bled, not blood but that gray, syrupy fluid, thick and glistening, flecked with dark specks that moved as if alive. Worse, the threads had reacted, lashing out like tiny whips, curling around the knife's edge as if to pull it deeper. He dropped the blade, sobbing, and watched as the wound pulsed faster, the eye blinking rapidly, as if mocking his attempt. Now, he avoided sharp objects, afraid of what else might emerge if he tried again. The apartment had become a prison, its walls closing in, the air heavy with a dampness that seemed to seep from the wound itself. The water stain on the ceiling had spread, its edges now jagged, like the teeth of some vast, unseen mouth. The windows were fogged with condensation, the glass streaked with trails that looked too much like fingers dragging through the mist. Outside, Burlington was silent, the usual hum of traffic replaced by an oppressive stillness, broken only by the occasional caw of a crow perched on the fire escape. Ethan swore it was the same crow from days ago, its black eyes following him through the glass. He hadn't eaten in days, couldn't stomach the thought of food. The fridge was empty anyway, the milk curdled into a sour sludge that mirrored the fluid leaking from his shoulder. He drank water from the tap, but it tasted wrong, tainted, metallic, like the pipes were bleeding into it. His body felt foreign, a vessel he no longer controlled. The threads in his wound had grown longer, some curling outward like tendrils, others burrowing deeper, wrapping around the shattered bones in his shoulder. He could feel them moving, a slow, grinding sensation that sent shivers of nausea through him. His skin was splitting further, the cracks spreading down his arm, revealing glimpses of something beneath. Not muscle or bone, but a glistening black mass that pulsed with a life of its own. The whispers had grown louder, no longer just his name but a cacophony of guttural sounds, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language he couldn't grasp. They came from the wound, from the eye, resonating in his chest, his skull. Sometimes, in the haze of exhaustion, he thought he understood fragments. Grow, consume, become, but the words slipped away like smoke. He hadn't slept properly in days, only drifting into feverish naps filled with visions of the forest. The boulder he'd struck, its surface slick with that dark, viscous sap, the roots that seemed to pulse underfoot, the air that hummed with a low, unnatural frequency. In one dream, he saw himself standing in the forest, his shoulders split open, the eyes staring up at the sky as the trees bent toward him, their branches curling like fingers. He tried to hide the wound, wrapping it in layers of gauze, but the bandages soaked through within hours, the gray fluid seeping into the fabric, leaving stains that shimmered faintly in the dark. The smell was unbearable now, a miasma that filled the apartment, clinging to the walls, the furniture, his skin. He wore a heavy coat even indoors, the collar pulled high to cover the wound, but it did little to mask the truth. His reflection was a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure with skin so pale it looked translucent, veins standing out like dark rivers beneath the surface. His left arm hung at an odd angle, the bones inside grinding audibly with every movement, as if the threads were reshaping them, carving them into something new. In a moment of reckless desperation, Ethan tore off the bandages, unable to stand the suffocating weight of them. The wound was a horror now, a gaping maw of raw, glistening tissue, the black threads weaving through it like a living tapestry. The eye was larger, its surface rippling as it swiveled to meet his gaze. But there was something new, something worse. At the edge of the wound, where the skin had peeled back, a tiny, claw-like protrusion emerged, no bigger than a child's finger, its surface slick and black, twitching like an insect's leg. It moved independently, scraping against the exposed tissue, and Ethan screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed in the empty apartment. He stumbled to the living room, collapsing onto the couch, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The ceiling stain seemed to pulse above him, its edges curling inward, as if ready to swallow the room whole. The drip of the leak was deafening now, a rhythmic thud that matched the grinding in his shoulder. He clutched his head, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, forming words he couldn't ignore. You are ours. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw the walls ripple, the plaster cracking to reveal a dark, glistening surface beneath, like the flesh of some vast, unseen creature. Ethan dragged himself to the mirror, unable to resist the pull of his own destruction. The reflection wasn't his. Not anymore. The figure staring back was a mockery of humanity, its shoulder a writhing mass of threads and claws, the eye blinking slowly, deliberately. Its lips moved, but they weren't Ethan's lips. They were cracked, bloodless, curling into a smile that wasn't a smile. The voice came again, not from the wound but from the mirror, clear and cold. Look at what you're becoming. Ethan sat in the sterile chill of the Burlington Medical Center's operating room, the antiseptic smell sharp enough to burn his nostrils, yet unable to mask the rancid odor seeping from his shoulder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the green-tiled walls, which seemed to shimmer faintly, as if coated in a thin film of something alive. His left arm lay limp on the gurney, the skin around the wound cracked and peeling, exposing a writhing mass of black threads in that unblinking glossy eye, now the size of a golf ball. The claw-like protrusion had grown, its black, chitinous surface twitching with a life of its own, scraping against the raw tissue. The air was thick with the stench of decay, burnt plastic, rotting earth, and a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat, making every breath a struggle. He'd staggered into the emergency room hours earlier, unable to bear the horror any longer. The whispers, "You are ours," had grown deafening, echoing not just from the wound but from the walls of his apartment, the dripping ceiling, the fogged windows streaked with unnatural trails. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, his body a hollow shell consumed by the thing in his shoulder. The ER staff had recoiled at the sight of the wound, their professional detachment crumbling as the gray fluid oozed onto the exam table, leaving shimmering stains that smelled of death. The surgeon, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, had called it a severe abscess and scheduled an immediate procedure to remove it, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she adjusted her gloves. Now, as the anesthesiologist prepped the floor, Ethan's mind raced, clinging to the hope that this would end it. The operating room was a stark contrast to his apartment's decay, clean, orderly, a bastion of science against the nightmare consuming him. Yet even here, the air felt wrong, heavy with a dampness that shouldn't exist in a sterile environment. The ceiling tiles seemed to ripple, their edges curling like the water stain in his apartment, and the hum of the lights carried a faint, guttural undertone, like the whispers that haunted him. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the pain in his shoulder flared, a searing heat that pulsed in time with the claws twitching. The anesthesia took hold, a cold rush spreading through his veins, and the world blurred into darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. He dreamed of the forest again, the green mountains alive with a malevolent pulse. The boulder he'd struck during his fall loomed before him, its surface slick with black sap that moved like liquid shadow, pooling at his feet. The trees bent toward him, their branches curling like fingers, and the air hummed with that same guttural voice, now chanting words he couldn't grasp. His shoulder split open in the dream, the eyes staring up at the sky, the threads weaving through his bones, reshaping them into something grotesque, something other. He woke to the beep of monitors, his throat raw, his body heavy. The surgeon stood over him, her face pale behind her mask. "We got it out," she said, her voice tight. "It was unusual. We've sent samples to the lab." Ethan tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, tasting of blood and metal. He glanced at his shoulder, now swathed in clean bandages, the skin around it red and raw but mercifully still. The pain was duller, a faint ache rather than the searing agony of before. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. They kept him overnight for observation, the hospital room a sterile cocoon of white walls and beeping machines. But even here, the world felt off. The air carried a faint whiff of that chemical rot, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. A nurse changed his bandages, her hands quick and efficient, but she avoided his eyes, her nose wrinkling as she peeled back the gauze. The wound was stitched shut, a jagged line of black thread crisscrossing his skin, but the surrounding flesh was pale, almost translucent, with faint, dark veins snaking beneath. "Looks clean," she said, but her voice wavered, and she left the room quickly, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan was discharged the next morning, his shoulder stiff but manageable, the pain a distant hum. He returned to his apartment, the familiar dampness greeting him like an old wound. The ceiling stain hadn't grown, but it seemed darker, its edges sharper, like a scar etched into the plaster. He avoided the mirror, afraid of what he might see, but forced himself to resume his routine. He answered Matt's texts, claiming a bad infection that was now under control. He even tried to work, opening his laptop to finish the brewery logo, but his left hand was clumsy, the fingers still tingling with a faint numbness that hadn't faded. For 2 days, he clung to normalcy, telling himself the worst was over. He showered, the hot water soothing against his skin, though the stitches itched, a faint nagging sensation that reminded him of the bump's early days. He ate, forcing down a sandwich despite the metallic taste that lingered in his mouth. He even ventured outside, walking Burlington's quiet streets, the autumn air crisp but heavy with the scent of wet leaves and something sharper, like rust. The crow was still there, perched on a lamppost, its black eyes tracking him as he passed. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter, and hurried home. But the hope was fragile, and the signs were there, subtle at first. The stitches itched more each day, the skin around them growing warm, then hot, as if something was stirring beneath. The metallic taste in his mouth grew stronger, coating his tongue like oil. At night, He dreamed of the forest again, the boulder pulsing like a heart, the sap pooling into shapes that weren't human. He woke each morning with a faint ache in his chest, just below his collarbone, where the skin felt too tight, too smooth. On the third night, he couldn't sleep, the itch in his shoulder now a burning pulse that kept him pacing the apartment. The ceiling leak dripped louder, the sound a rhythmic thud that matched the ache in his chest. He stood before the mirror, his heart pounding, and peeled back the bandages. The stitches were intact, but the skin beneath was wrong, swollen, grayish, with tiny, hairline cracks spreading outward. He pressed the wound, wincing, and felt it. A faint, hard lump, no bigger than a pea, pulsing beneath the surface. His breath caught, his vision blurring with tears, as a low, rasping whisper filled the room, not from the wound, but from his chest, where the new lump throbbed in time with his heartbeat. "We are not done." Ethan stood in his Burlington apartment, the air thick with the familiar stench of damp plaster and the faint, metallic tang that never seemed to leave him now. The ceiling leak had slowed to a faint drip, each plink a quiet reminder of the weeks that had unraveled him. His shoulder, stitched and scarred, was a map of his ordeal. Pale, puckered skin crisscrossed with black thread, the flesh around it still tender, still wrong. The surgery had removed the grotesque mass, the eye, the writhing threads, but the new lump in his chest pulsed faintly, a cruel echo of the horror he thought he'd escaped. It was smaller, subtler, but its presence was undeniable, a hard knot beneath his skin that throbbed with a rhythm that wasn't his own. He'd returned to work, or at least tried to. The brewery logo was finished, sent off to the client with a terse email, but the act felt hollow, like a performance for a life he no longer fit into. His apartment was a battlefield of avoidance. Mirrors covered with towels, windows kept shut despite the oppressive dampness, the ceiling stain ignored though its edges seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The crow still lingered outside, perched on the fire escape, its black eyes glinting with an intelligence that made Ethan's skin crawl. He hadn't spoken to Matt in days, dodging texts with vague excuses about being busy. The truth was too heavy, too impossible. His body was no longer his, and the world felt like it was watching, waiting for him to break. The lump in his chest grew slowly, its itch a constant nag, like a splinter burrowing deeper. At night, it burned, a low heat that spread through his ribs, making his breath shallow. He could feel it moving sometimes, a faint shift beneath the skin, as if something was settling in, making itself at home. The whispers had quieted since the surgery, but they hadn't stopped entirely. In the stillness of the apartment, when the leak's drip was the only sound, he caught fragments, "Stay, grow, ours," spoken in that guttural, inhuman voice that seemed to come from inside him, from the lump, from the very air. He tried to drown them out with music, with the TV, but the sounds bled through, a low hum that vibrated in his bones. Ethan avoided touching the lump, afraid of what he might feel, but he couldn't resist forever. One evening, standing in the bathroom, he peeled back his shirt, the fabric sticking to his skin with a faint, sticky pull. The chest lump was the size of a grape now, its surface smooth and gray, like the first bump on his shoulder. Tiny cracks radiated from it, the skin splitting to reveal glimpses of something dark and glistening beneath. He pressed it, wincing, and a bead of gray fluid oozed out, its chemical stench, burnt plastic and rotting earth, filling the room. His stomach churned, but he couldn't look away. The lump pulsed, and for a moment he thought he saw it shift, as if something inside was pressing outward, testing the boundaries of his flesh. He stumbled back, his breath ragged, and sank onto the couch. The apartment was quiet, the drip of the leak a steady rhythm that matched the pulse in his chest. He thought of the forest, the boulder, the black sap that had coated his hands after the fall. It had been alive, he was sure of it now. Something ancient, something that had seeped into him, into his shattered bones and taken root. The dreams hadn't stopped, the trees bending toward him, their branches curling like claws, the boulder humming with a voice that wasn't a voice, his body splitting open to reveal a writhing black mass that wasn't human. Each night, he woke gasping, his chest burning, the lump a little larger, a little more alive. He considered running, to a doctor, to a priest, to anyone who might listen, but the thought paralyzed him. What could he say? That his body was betraying him, growing something that whispered his name? That he saw eyes and claws where flesh should be? The shame was crushing, a weight heavier than the pain. He'd always been the one who handled things, who didn't need help, but now he was unraveling, his body a stranger, his mind a fragile thread stretched to breaking. Yet, there was a part of him that wanted to live, to fight. He forced himself back into the world, walking Burlington streets, the autumn air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. He passed strangers who didn't look twice, their normalcy a stark contrast to the chaos inside him. He even met Matt for coffee, sitting in a crowded cafe, the clink of cups and hum of conversation a temporary shield. Matt noticed the change, Ethan's pallor, the way he favored his right arm, the faint chemical smell that lingered around him. But he didn't press, just clapped Ethan on his good shoulder and said, "You'll bounce back, man." Ethan nodded, forcing a smile, but the lump in his chest pulsed, a silent rebuke. Back home, he tried to reclaim his routine. He cleaned the apartment, scrubbing the floors until his hands ached, though the dampness seemed to seep back in the moment he stopped. He threw out the moldy takeout containers, opened the windows to let in the cool night air, but the chemical stench followed him, a constant reminder. The ceiling stain remained, its edges now a deep, inky black, like a wound that refused to heal. He avoided the mirror but caught his reflection in the glass of the microwave. A gaunt figure, eyes hollow, skin too pale, with faint, dark veins creeping across his chest. As days passed, the lump didn't grow, but it didn't shrink either. The itch subsided to a dull hum, the whispers faded to a faint murmur, and Ethan began to wonder if he'd imagined the worst of it. Maybe the surgery had worked, maybe the forest was just a memory, maybe he could rebuild. He returned to work, took walks, even laughed at Matt's bad jokes over beers at the Rusty Nail. But the hope was fragile, a house of cards waiting for a breeze. One night, as he lay in bed, the apartment quiet except for the soft patter of rain outside, Ethan felt a strange calm. His chest ached, but it was bearable, a companion he'd learned to live with. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, and for once, the dreams didn't haunt him. But as he drifted off, a faint sound broke the silence, a brittle crack like a twig snapping, coming from deep within his chest. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding, and he touched the lump, feeling it pulse, harder now, more insistent. The rain outside grew heavier, its rhythm uneven, and as he listened, he realized it wasn't rain at all. The drops against the window were too dark, too thick, leaving streaks that shimmered like the black sap from his dreams, whispering his name in the language of the forest.